Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before a 300-pound armed man would storm through the trauma bay doors and change everything. St. Michael's graveyard shift hums with fluorescent buzz and antiseptic burn, the San Diego trauma bay a cathedral of cold steel and linoleum that never truly sleeps. Margaret Walsh moves through the chaos with eerie precision, no wasted motion, no hesitation, hand steady as surgical lasers. 52 years old. Grey hair pulled military tight in a bun that hasn't loosened in 6 months. When a coding patient needs immediate vascular access and the attending freezes, Margaret performs a flawless subclavian line insertion in 40 seconds flat, her fingers moving with muscle memory that has nothing to do with nursing school. The attending watches. The residents watch. Nobody asks questions. They just move. In her locker sits a pair of worn combat boots she never explains. Size 9. Laces threaded a specific way. She removes them once a week, runs her thumb across the scarred leather, then tucks them back into the darkness. A slight limp favors her left leg when she thinks no one is watching. By the 3rd hour of a 12-hour shift, the limp vanishes. Habit, not healing. Dr. Whitfield has been watching for 6 months and 23 days. He'd made his bet during the first week, staff lounge, mid-morning, the coffee pot percolating that acidic brown sludge nobody should drink. Whitfield stood by the window overlooking the parking garage, his tie the color of a tax deduction, his smile the color of a knife. New nurse on graveyard. He'd said it to nobody in particular, the way alpha dogs mark territory. Former military or something. Quiet. Real quiet. I give her 4 weeks. Month ends, she'll have quit. Nobody contradicted him. Nobody ever did. Whitfield was the ER director, built his career on hospital politics and board connections the way other men build houses. 15 years of favors, alliances, the careful orchestration of who got promoted and who got pushed out. 1 phone call and a resident lost a fellowship. Another call and a nurse found herself transferred to the pediatric ward on permanent nights. He was competent enough at emergency medicine, but that wasn't his real skill. His real skill was making sure everyone understood the hierarchy and his place at the top of it. The new nurse, Margaret Walsh, according to the file, had kneeled when she gathered the bet's weight in silence. 6 months passed. She didn't quit. She didn't complain. She didn't cry into a supply closet or call in sick or ask for day shifts. She showed up at 6:51 p.m. every night, 5 minutes before shift start, her scrubs already on, her tag already clipped. She worked. She saved people. She never once acknowledged Whitfield's existence beyond a simple doctor when protocol required it. That was the problem. That silence. That competence. That refusal to break. By month 3, Whitfield escalated. He'd knock into her in the hallway, hard enough to make her stumble. Watch where you're going, sweetheart. She'd steady herself, step aside, continue her work. He'd ask her to pull impossible charts, records that didn't exist, patients discharged 5 years prior, and when she reported they weren't available, he'd say it loud enough for the nursing station to hear, seems like we hired someone who can't do basic clerical work. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just kept working. The morning of the cafeteria incident, the lunch rush was at full tide, ER staff grabbing 30 seconds between traumas, the line moving like a triage protocol in reverse. Margaret had loaded her tray with mechanical efficiency, thermos of coffee, a salad she'd prepared at home, a banana, a water bottle. She stood in line. Whitfield saw her. He walked up from behind like weather moving in. "Excuse me." He pressed his body against her shoulder, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that couldn't hide the sweat underneath. She turned slightly, her tray still balanced. "I need to get through here." The line had plenty of space. He could have moved around. Instead, he reached across her tray as if it were invisible, his arm deliberately glancing the edge, the physics of his movement calculated. His elbow connected. Not an accident. The trajectory was too precise. The tray went vertical, then horizontal. The world moved in frames, coffee spraying, the thermos rolling across the tile floor in a copper-bright arc, the salad container spinning, lettuce scattered like confetti, the banana bouncing twice, the water bottle cracking against the linoleum and sliding. Charts she'd been carrying, patient histories, medication logs, splattered into the chaos. The entire cafeteria froze. 30 people. All watching. All silent. The room went dead silent. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Whitfield said it loud, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that only works if you've studied the specific architecture of power. "Seems you're a little clumsy today." Every eye in the cafeteria was on her. The attending physicians. The residents. The other nurses, her potential allies, who suddenly became very interested in their phones. The surgical teams. The respiratory therapists. Everyone waiting to see what she would do. The right reaction, tears, anger, defensiveness, would have given Whitfield exactly what he wanted. Proof of instability. Proof she didn't belong. Proof the hierarchy was working. Margaret kneeled. Her movements were methodical. Unhurried. She gathered the scattered items with the precision of someone diffusing a device, each motion deliberate, each placement intentional. The banana went first. Then the water bottle. Then the thermos, which she had to retrieve from 3 feet away, rolling still. The salad container. The charts, dampened now, still legible. Not a single item was left behind. Her jaw was locked. Her expression blank as snow. Her hands didn't shake. She stood. The tray was reassembled. The floor was clear. She turned to Whitfield with eyes the color of storm-gray water, held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, not a challenge, just an acknowledgement that she'd heard him, and walked to the disposal area without a word. The cafeteria unfroze. Conversations resumed. Whitfield stood alone, his face flushing because his calculated humiliation had produced exactly nothing. No tears. No anger. No breaking. Just a woman on her knees picking up spilled coffee while the rest of the world watched her not react. But that wasn't the worst part. That night's trauma was a gunshot victim, male, 32, found in an alley near Imperial Avenue with a chest wound and altered mental status. The bullet had nicked something critical. His airway was compromised. The attending called for intubation, reached for the equipment, and the patient began to seize. Full tonic-clonic. Body rigid. Oxygen saturation plummeting. 85. 82. 78. The attending froze. It was only a moment, 3 seconds of paralysis where the next decision diverges into branches of success and death. 3 seconds where the entire room understood that they were about to lose him. Margaret moved. She didn't request permission. She didn't ask. She walked to the bedside, her hands already moving, already knowing. She grabbed a 14-gauge needle, not for access but for something else, something that belonged to a different protocol, a different world. A needle for a procedure that required precision and faith in muscle memory. "I need a ballpoint pen." Her voice was low. Flat. Not a request. Not quite a command. Something else. Something that came from somewhere that wasn't a hospital in San Diego. A nurse, young, terrified, handed her a pen. Margaret took it. Breathed once. Found the space between the second and third intercostal space, midclavicular line, and pushed through. The hiss of air escaping, that specific sound of a tension pneumothorax releasing, filled the room like a prayer being answered. The needle went in. The pen went in. A makeshift catheter. An improvised airway. The kind of procedure they taught in military medicine when you were alone and the patient was dying and nobody else was coming. The pulse ox climbed. 85. 90. 95. 100. The seizure stopped. The patient's breathing steadied. The attending, who'd been frozen, suddenly found his voice again and started issuing orders, and the room moved, and the crisis transformed into a recovery, and everyone understood without being told that the new nurse on Graveyard had just saved a man with a pen and hands that had done this before. In the recovery bed next to the gunshot victim, a grizzled patient in his 70s, former Army Ranger, according to his chart, admitted with pneumonia and refusing to complain about it, had watched the entire sequence. His eyes tracked every movement. The precision. The knowledge. The certainty in her hands. When she passed his bed during post-procedure rounds, checking vitals, he reached out. Not aggressive. Gentle. His weathered hand caught her wrist, the one with the faded scar tissue along the inside, barely visible, the kind you get from shrapnel or broken glass or surviving things that weren't supposed to survive. He locked eyes with her. His voice was barely above a whisper, the kind of voice that carried weight. "I know those hands," he said. Margaret's jaw tightened for just a moment. She didn't pull away. She looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Not breaking. Never breaking. But acknowledging. She didn't answer. She just nodded once and moved on to the next room, her hand steady as stone, the combat boots waiting in her locker like a secret, like a confession she'd never make, like the answer to a question nobody at St. Michael's was brave enough to ask. The morning shift change arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, and Dr. Whitfield owned the staff lounge the way generals own battlefields. 20 nurses clustered around the coffee station, residents still holding their empty cups from overnight, day shift techs dropping their bags on chairs, the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical hymn. Whitfield stood at the center, his $500 tie catching the light, his smile the kind that politicians practice in mirrors. "I'll give anyone here $20, he announced, voice pitched to Carrie, "if Grandma Walsh makes it a full week without crying to HR." The room quieted just enough to prove they were listening. She's got that look, you know, the kind who thinks experience matters more than following the chain of command. The kind who never figures out that nursing isn't about knowing things. It's about knowing your place. Laughter rippled through the room like water finding its level. Someone snorted. Whitfield's smile widened. He was good at this, not just the cruelty, but the performance of it, the way he made it seem like everyone agreed, like mockery was the default language between people who understood hospitals. Margaret stood at the coffee station, her grey hair pulled tight in a bun, pouring cream into a cup that had lost its handle sometime in the previous century. Her hands didn't move any differently. Her face didn't change. She simply added the cream, set the pot down with a soft clink, and turned toward the door. The room watched her. Whitfield watched her hardest of all, searching for the flinch, the flush, the small break in composure that would tell him the $20 bet was already won. She walked past him without making eye contact. Her limp was barely visible. 3 days later, during the lunch rush, the cafeteria was chaos, 80 hospital workers compressed into a space meant for 40, trays clinking, conversations overlapping, the smell of overheated plastic and something vaguely resembling beef stroganoff hanging in the air. Margaret sat at a table in the corner, alone, charting patient notes on a laminated tablet. She'd learned by the second day that eating alone was safer. Lunch wasn't about food. It was about staying away from Whitfield. He came anyway. He walked past her table the way he walked past everything that didn't matter to him, casually, with the weight of someone used to moving through the world without obstruction. At the exact moment he passed, his hip connected with her tray. Not an accident. The timing was too precise, the angle too deliberate. The tray flipped. Coffee spilled across the tile in a dark arc. Her sandwich fell cheese-side down. Her chart scattered, pages sliding across wet floor, ink bleeding where the liquid touched. The crash silenced 50 conversations. A fork clattered. Someone gasped. Whitfield stopped, turned, and looked at her with an expression of mild surprise, as if the universe had inconvenienced him. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "You're making a mess." The room held its breath. Margaret didn't stand immediately. She sat for exactly 2 seconds, long enough that the room thought she might not move at all, long enough that Whitfield's smile faltered for an instant. Then she rose with the careful precision of someone whose body had learned, years ago, that injured people had to move differently. She kneeled. The tile was wet and warm. She gathered the pages first, stacking them in order despite the coffee stains, her movements methodical, her face as blank as hospital walls. The sandwich. The plastic cup. Fragments of the plate that had broken on impact. Each item placed in the trash with the same unhurried precision she'd use in a trauma bay, the same focus she'd use to save a life. She stood, wiped her palms on a napkin, and walked back to her table without looking at Whitfield. Without looking at anyone. The conversations around her resumed like water closing over a stone. Whitfield returned to his usual table, and she heard him laugh, that sharp, triumphant sound of someone who'd landed a clean blow. 1 week became 2. 2 became 4. During a chart review on a Thursday morning, Whitfield threw her documentation across the nurse's station. The papers scattered like seagulls. "This is garbage, Walsh. Did they teach you to write in whatever nursing program you mail-ordered your degree from?" His voice carried enough for the junior staff to hear, enough for the residents to know they should be careful around her. Margaret rewrote the documentation in silence, every letter precise, every note clinical and perfect. He said nothing when she handed it back. He didn't need to. The message was already delivered. The pattern developed its own rhythm. Assignments to the worst shifts. Double shifts on overnight when the hospital ran thin. The most difficult patients, the violent ones, the family members who screamed about incompetence, the cases that ended in death and left you scrubbing your hands raw in the bathroom at 3 in the morning. Whitfield had a gift for surgical humiliation. He never quite crossed into something that would trigger HR. It was always plausible deniability, always something that looked like normal hospital assignment when documented, always something he could claim was based on patient acuity or training needs. "Walsh, take room 7. His combative and his yours for the shift. Walsh, you're on the night float. We need someone experienced with difficult families. Walsh, you're doing the scut work in the ICU, maybe you'll learn something about proper charting." She absorbed it all the way certain materials absorb impact without breaking, not by being soft, but by being stronger than the force hitting them. Margaret never defended herself. Never reacted. Never complained to anyone. She simply moved from patient to patient, from shift to shift, performing her duties with a competence so evident that even Whitfield's mockery couldn't diminish it. When she managed a patient in sepsis, the sepsis protocols were flawless. When she restrained a combative trauma patient, the restraints were humane and secure. When she charted, the documentation was so thorough that junior residents used her notes as examples. But something else was happening in the staff dynamics, something Whitfield didn't control. The junior nurses began noticing the pattern. The residents started paying attention to how Margaret's patients had lower complication rates, better post-discharge outcomes, fewer family complaints. A charge nurse from the night shift mentioned, quietly, to another charge nurse, that she'd never seen anyone manage difficult cases with that level of composure. The ranger patient from Bay 4, still admitted, recovering slowly from his wounds, asked specifically for Margaret during his care, and when she came, he said nothing, but his eyes tracked her with recognition, like someone watching a familiar landmark emerge from fog. Whitfield noticed the shift. He could feel it the way predators feel when their authority erodes. So he escalated. During a morning briefing in front of 6 junior staff members and 2 residents, he cornered her at the medication station. "You know what I'm curious about, Walsh?" His voice was pitched low, conversational, the kind of voice that made the people nearby lean in to listen. "Your background. You've got references from places I can't quite verify. Nursing school from, what was it, San Diego State? I called them. They said they don't have records of anyone by your name graduating from their program." The medication tray in Margaret's hands didn't stop moving. She continued drawing up a heparin drip with the same steady pressure, the same precise angle. The needle found the vial perfectly. I did my training elsewhere, she said, and her voice was so quiet that Whitfield actually had to lean closer to hear it. Elsewhere? He smiled. You're going to have to be more specific for our credentialing committee. Because right now, it looks like you might not be properly licensed to practice in the state of California. He let that hang in the air. That would be a problem, wouldn't it? A problem for you. Margaret capped the syringe. She set it in the medication tray. She turned to face him, and when their eyes met, she didn't look away. My credentials are in order, she said. Still quiet. Still controlled. You can verify with the state board if you need to. I already did. He wasn't smiling anymore. What I need you to understand, Walsh, is that I built this trauma bay. Every protocol, every standard, every expectation of excellence comes from me. And if you can't follow the hierarchy, if you can't show proper respect to the people who trained this department, then maybe your background isn't the only thing we need to investigate. She picked up the medication tray. My patients are waiting, she said. She walked past him toward the ICU without waiting for a response. Behind her, she heard one of the junior residents whisper to another, "Did that really just happen?" And the other one whisper back, "Yeah." "And did you see her face?" Didn't even change. That night, alone in her 2008 Honda CR-V in the St. Michael's parking garage, Margaret sat in the driver's seat with the engine off. The parking garage was silent except for the occasional hum of a car alarm testing itself in the distance. Rain began to fall against the windshield, not hard, but steady, the kind of rain that came to San Diego maybe 3 times a year and made everyone forget how to drive. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. Her hands, folded against the plastic, didn't shake. They never shook in public. Not anymore. Not for 18 years. Not since Tikrit. But here, alone, in the dark, with the rain and the silence, the tremor started in her forearms and spread upward, not weakness, not fear, but something else. Pressure. The accumulation of days where she had to be smaller than she was, quieter than she knew how to be, less than what her hands had trained to do. She sat like that for 5 minutes. Then 10. Then she straightened, wiped her eyes with the back of her palm, and turned the key. The engine started. The lights came on. She drove out of the parking garage and into the rain-soaked night, her jaw locked, her expression blank as stone, ready for whatever Whitfield would try next. She didn't know that when he tried it, the whole hospital would have to choose a side. She didn't know that her silence had already impressed itself on people who remembered what real strength looked like. She didn't know that one of those people was watching, waiting for the moment when she would finally stop being invisible. At 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, 14 hours after Whitfield's threat about her credentials, the trauma bay doors exploded inward with enough force to make the hinges scream. Margaret was alone in Bay 3, checking the supplies in the crash cart, running through the muscle memory of emergency protocol. The sound was impossible to misinterpret. That wasn't a patient on a gurney. That was violence arriving. The man who entered was the size of a linebacker, not just tall but wide, 300 pounds of rage and panic wrapped in a red hoodie, veins bulging in his neck like cords, eyes wild and unfocused. He was holding a pistol like a man who'd never held one before, which made him exponentially more dangerous. His finger wasn't on the trigger, but it was close, and his hand was shaking in the way that suggested he didn't know where the weapon was actually pointed. "Where are the doctors?" he roared, spit flying from his mouth. "My brother's dying in the waiting room and nobody's helping him." Staff scattered like birds from gunfire. A nurse behind the central station dove sideways, pulling a junior tech with her. An attending physician disappeared into the stairwell. The charge nurse who'd been filing charts ran for the back exit, shouting into her radio, "Active shooter, trauma bay, all units, secure the perimeter." Alarms began to wail from the security system. Red lights started flashing in the corridors beyond. Dr. Whitfield emerged from the medication room for exactly 3 seconds. His eyes locked on the weapon. He pivoted immediately and dove into a supply closet near Bay 1, pulling the door shut behind him. Margaret watched all of this, the dispersal, the panic, the instinctive scramble for safety, and she didn't move. She set down the supply tray. She straightened. She walked directly toward the man, not fast, not slow, her limp barely visible against the chaos. 30 feet. 25. The man's attention was everywhere at once, the scattered staff, the empty bays, the doors leading deeper into the hospital. He hadn't noticed Margaret yet. She was just another nurse in scrubs. Nothing remarkable. Nothing worth the attention of someone whose brother was dying. "I'm a nurse," Margaret said, her voice low and even, the same tone she'd used 18 years ago in Fallujah when a young Marine came back from a firefight with shrapnel in his legs and eyes that had seen things that couldn't be unseen. Not commands. Not fear. Just sound. Just presence. "I'm going to help your brother. But I need you to breathe with me first." The man's head whipped toward her. The pistol rose instinctively, pointing somewhere in the direction of her chest, though his hand was shaking badly enough that the aim was unpredictable. "Nobody's listening," he gasped, his voice cracking. "He's dying. I've been waiting for 2 hours and nobody." Margaret kept walking. 15 feet. 10. She kept her hands visible, open, her shoulders angled to make herself a smaller target while maintaining control of the distance. "I'm listening. Right now. Tell me his name." "What?" "Your brother's name. Tell me." The man's mouth opened and closed. The gun wavered. "Danny. His name is Danny." "Okay." Margaret was 5 feet away now. She could see the whites around his pupils, the sweat on his forehead, the way his entire body was vibrating with adrenaline. "Thank you for telling me, Danny's brother. My name is Margaret. I'm going to help Danny, but I need you to take a breath with me first. In through your nose. Can you do that?" He breathed. Actually breathed. The gun lowered slightly. His eye stayed on her face, searching, trying to determine if she was lying or if she actually meant what she said. Behind Margaret, a grizzled patient in Bay 4, the ranger, the one with the faded tattoo on his forearm that read like a combat autobiography, watched her stance, her movement, the way she controlled space without touching anything. His eyes narrowed. His breathing steadied. He'd seen this before. He knew what it meant when someone moved like that. Like they'd trained to walk into bullets. "Let's find Danny," Margaret said quietly. "Can you show me where he is?" The man lowered the pistol the rest of the way. His shoulders sagged like all the panic had been holding him up, and now, suddenly, he was too tired to stand. The waiting room. He just collapsed. Nobody was helping him. Margaret guided him with her voice, with her presence, with the strange authority that comes from someone who's already decided not to be afraid. They walked out of the trauma bay together, his weapon hanging at his side, her hand positioned to move if his grip changed. Security was 30 seconds out. SWAT was 12 minutes from the hospital. The entire thing took less than 90 seconds from the moment he entered to the moment Margaret had him sitting in a chair in the waiting room, his brother, a 23-year-old with blue lips and seizing muscles, already on a gurney being wheeled back toward Bay 3. Margaret never waited for Whitfield's orders. She was already moving, already shouting for the crash. The entire emergency took 11 minutes. When it was over, when the brother was stabilized and the father was arrested and the security team was standing down, Margaret washed her hands at the sink in Bay 3. The soap was cheap and smelled like industrial flowers. The water was hot. She watched the blood disappear down the drain. Dr. Whitfield emerged from the supply closet. He stood for a moment, surveying the scene, the empty bays, the cleaned equipment, Margaret at the sink, and his jaw clenched in a way that suggested he was calculating something. His credibility threat had just evaporated. His bet about her quitting was obviously lost. And she had just, in front of everyone, saved a life with a level of competence that made his own credentials look quaint. The ranger in Bay 4 was watching her still. When Margaret finished washing and turned around, she found him looking directly at her. Not with the confused gratitude of a patient, With recognition. With the knowledge of someone who'd just watched a legend move through the world pretending to be ordinary. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His eyes held the question that everyone in the trauma bay was too shocked to ask. But Margaret already knew what was coming. At 2:17 a.m., the trauma bay doors exploded inward like someone had breached them with a battering ram. A man stood in the threshold, 300 pounds of rage wrapped in a stained grey hoodie, one massive fist wrapped around a pistol that caught the fluorescent light like something alive and hungry. His eyes were wild, pupils blown wide, and the veins in his neck stood out like cords of rope about to snap. "Where are they?" he screamed, his voice cracking with something between fury and desperation. "Where are the doctors? My brother is dying out there and nobody's doing anything." The pistol rose, fell, rose again. His hand trembled, not from fear but from the kind of adrenaline spike that makes muscles twitch involuntarily. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent. Chaos is contagious. The trauma team scattered like startled birds. A resident bolted for the medication room. 2 nurses dove behind the central station, their chairs rolling backward with pneumatic hisses. A respiratory therapist sprinted toward the back corridor, his shoes squeaking against the polished tile in a rhythm that sounded like a distress call. A security guard fumbled for his radio, his voice coming out in strangled bursts. "We have an active, we have a 10 to 33 in trauma." The gunman swung the weapon toward the sound. "Shut it down. Shut it all down. My brother came in 40 minutes ago, ODD in the waiting room, and nobody's even looked at him. You're all standing around doing nothing while he dies." Dr. Whitfield emerged from the supply closet near the far wall, saw the gun, and froze in the doorway with a stack of crystalloid bags pressed against his chest like a shield. His face had gone the color of old newspaper. Margaret Walsh stood at the central supply station, hands resting on the edge of the counter. She didn't move. She didn't reach for a phone. She didn't back away. Instead, she stepped forward. Her movements were deliberate, economical, the kind of motion that comes from someone who has calculated every variable. 1 step. 2 steps. Slow. The kind of slow that doesn't trigger the predatory response in human nervous systems. Predators recognize fast movements. They recognize sudden directional changes. They recognize the stance of someone preparing to flee or fight. Slow walking toward danger looks like something else entirely. It looks like inevitability. "Hey," she said, and her voice dropped into a register that was barely above a murmur. It was the voice of someone speaking in a room where the smallest sound carries weight. "Hey, I hear you." The gunman's head snapped toward her. He hadn't noticed her until that moment. She'd been standing in plain sight, but there was something about her posture that didn't register as a threat, and so his amygdala had simply filed her away as background noise. Now she had his attention, and the pistol swung to track her movement like a compass needle finding magnetic north. "Your brother," Margaret continued, taking another slow step forward. Her hands were open, palms visible. Not surrendering, just transparent. "Tell me about your brother." "Don't move," the gunman said, but his voice had changed. It had lost some of its edge, replaced by something rawer. The voice of someone drowning. "Don't you move toward me." "I'm staying right here," Margaret said, and she did. She stopped, maintaining distance. She'd crossed enough space to be in his peripheral vision without being close enough to trigger the fear response. The stance of someone who was listening. "What's his name?" The question hung there for a moment. The pistol wavered, its barrel drifting slightly downward. Around them, the hospital had gone so quiet you could hear the ambient hum of the HVAC system, a sound so constant it usually disappeared into the background but now seemed like the only thing alive in the room besides the 3 of them. "Marcus," the gunman said finally, and the word cracked like thin ice. "His name's Marcus. He's 22. He's a good kid, he got in with some people, some friends who thought heroin was." His voice dissolved into something that wasn't quite sobs but wasn't quite rage either. It was the sound of someone whose entire world was collapsing in real time. And he overdosed in your waiting room 40 minutes ago and nobody's done anything. Nobody even came out to tell me what's happening. Someone did, Margaret said, and her voice had taken on a tone that she'd developed over 18 years of working trauma bays in Tikrit, talking down Marines who'd seen things that had rewired their fear circuits. A tone that said, I see you. I understand. You are not alone in this. Someone came out. That person was me. Your brother Marcus came in unresponsive. We got his airway secured. We got him on a monitor. His oxygen saturation is climbing. The lies came out smooth and practiced because they weren't lies, they were tactical truth. By the time she finished the sentence, it would be true. The code team would have already gotten to him. The gunman's breathing had changed. It was still rapid, still elevated, but it had shifted from the jagged hyperventilation of panic to something almost sustainable. The pistol had lowered another few degrees. Is he going to be okay? I don't know yet, Margaret said, which was the only honest thing she could say. But I do know that the best chance he has is if I can get back in there and help the doctors. Can you help me with that? Can you help Marcus? The gunman stared at her for 3 seconds. The pistol hung at his side now, the barrel pointing toward the floor. His hand was still trembling, but the trembling had shifted from the sharp spasms of someone in acute crisis to something closer to exhaustion, the kind of trembling that comes after adrenaline has burned through your system and left you hollow. I don't want to hurt anyone, he said, and his voice had become something almost childlike. Confused. Lost. I just want my brother to be okay. I know, Margaret said. She took one more step forward, slowly, and reached out her hand. Her palm was open. Give me the gun. Let me help Marcus. The gunman looked at the weapon in his hand like he'd never seen it before. Like it had appeared there by magic and he was only now realizing it was real. His fingers opened almost of their own accord, muscle memory operating without conscious instruction. Margaret caught the pistol as it fell, her grip secure and practiced. She ejected the magazine, still loaded, rounds intact, and cleared the chamber in movement so fluid they looked like a single continuous gesture. By the time a hospital security officer appeared in the doorway, weapon drawn, Margaret had already secured both the gun and the magazine on a high shelf behind the central station, her expression blank as fresh concrete. He needs to sit down, she said to the security officer, her voice already shifting back toward the register of someone with authority. Get him a chair. Get him water. Call San Diego PD, tell them we have a voluntary mental health crisis. Tell them the subject is cooperative. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from someone accustomed to having their instructions followed. The security officer hesitated for just a moment. Margaret was a nurse, he was security, then nodded and moved to comply. A code alert came through the hospital intercom, crackling like static. Code blue, waiting room. Code blue, waiting room. Margaret was already moving. She didn't run, running looks panicked. She walked with purpose, her stride eating up distance, her mind already cycling through the differential diagnosis, heroin overdose plus cardiac depression plus possible arrhythmia plus respiratory depression. The patient needed naloxone, oxygen, a full 12-lead EKG, and someone who could read the rhythm and knew what to do when the body stopped cooperating. She pushed through the waiting room doors and found Marcus on the floor, a code team forming a loose circle around him while a resident stood frozen, hand on the crash cart like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to use it. The patient's lips had taken on a blue-gray tint. His breathing was shallow, nearly imperceptible. His oxygen saturation, displayed on the portable monitor someone had dragged over, read 58%. 16-gauge angiocath, push 2 milligrams naloxone 4, cardiac monitor leads, Margaret said, moving into position. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't explain her authority. She simply gave the orders that needed giving, and the code team complied because there was something in her voice that was simply too certain to argue with. What's his last known vitals? Blood pressure 64/40, heart rate 34, respiratory rate 8, a resident said, the same resident who'd bolted for the medication room 5 minutes earlier. He was back now, his professional composure reasserting itself. "We've been bagging him manually." "I've got it," Margaret said, taking the bag valve mask from the nurse holding it. She sealed the mask against Marcus's face with the kind of precision that came from hundreds, thousands, of practice repetitions. Each compression of the rebreather bag was controlled, deliberate, designed to push exactly the right volume of oxygen into lungs that had forgotten how to work on their own. "Push the naloxone." A nurse inserted the fall line with a quick, efficient motion. The medication went in. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. Marcus's body jerked as the naloxone hit his system, reversing the opioid depression like flipping a switch. His breath came in a gasp, ragged and desperate, his oxygen saturation climbing, 64%, 72%, 81%. His pupils, which had been pinned to the size of match heads, began to dilate. His heart rate, which had been drifting dangerously low, kicked back up to something sustainable. "Sinus rhythm," someone called out, reading the monitor. "Stable." The waiting room had gone completely still except for the sound of Marcus's breathing, harsh, ragged, alive. His father stood in the doorway, one hand pressed against his mouth, tears streaming down his face. Margaret was already setting up for transport, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact sequence of movements hundreds of times in 100 different contexts, always with the same calm precision. Dr. Whitfield emerged from the trauma bay behind her. He'd watched the entire sequence, watched her walk toward an armed man, watched her de-escalate a crisis that could have ended in death, watched her take control of a code that was circling the drain and pull it back to something survivable. He watched her hands as she worked, and something in his face shifted into an expression that looked like calculation. "Good work," he said quietly, which was the only thing he could say without admitting that he'd stood frozen in a supply closet while a nurse did his job. Then he turned and walked back toward the trauma bay, his phone already in his hand, and Margaret continued working, unaware that the real crisis had only just begun. By dawn, by the time the sun was painting San Diego in shades of gold and copper, Dr. Whitfield had made 7 phone calls. 3 to board members who owed him favors. 2 to the hospital legal team. 1 to someone claiming to be Margaret's nursing school reference. 1 to the state licensing board, his voice carrying the kind of measured concern that sounds more damning than any outright accusation. "Unsanctioned procedures," he told them, his tone regretful and careful. "Cardiac interventions performed by nursing staff without physician oversight. Patient endangerment. I hate to be the one to raise concerns, but someone has to protect the institution." By 9 a.m., Margaret was called to HR. By 10 a.m., she was suspended. The overdose patient's heart was drowning in its own fluid. Blood pressure 70/40. The monitor screened a rhythm that was all sound and no perfusion, the electrical signal firing, but the mechanical squeeze had collapsed. Cardiac tamponade. Pressure around the heart chambers crushing them flat like a fist closing. Oxygen sat dropping, 92, 88, 74. The brother in the corner, sedated now, breathing controlled, stable, but this one, the one who'd brought the gun, was exsanguinating from the inside out. Margaret called out, "Pericardiocentesis kit. Now." A resident hesitated. "I'll call Dr. Whitfield, he's still in the building." "Now." "Patient's in arrest." The resident ran. 30 seconds passed like minutes. The monitor's rhythm degraded further. 68. 59. The ticking clock wasn't measured in minutes anymore, it was measured in heartbeats that weren't delivering oxygen. Hand steady. No tremor. No panic. Just data. Pain is information. Arrest is information. Desperation is someone else's emotion. The resident returned breathless. The code cart's on 4. Whitfield's in a meeting, nobody authorized. Margaret was already moving. She grabbed a penknife from the suture kit, old habit, military grade, blade sharp as a surgical instrument because surgical instruments were just expensive versions of what worked. A ballpoint pen lay on the counter. She took it. The plastic tube inside ballpoint pens is 18 mm in diameter. The human pericardium sits 4 to 6 centimeters below the skin surface at the xiphoid process. The math was simple. The execution required hands that had performed this exact procedure in Tikrit when the surgical teams were pinned and there was nothing else to use but what was on the ground. She prepped the site. Alcohol swab. No time for sterile field when the patient was coding. Speed was sterility now. Speed was life. The penknife made a small incision, ½ centimeter, controlled, between the ribs at the xiphoid process. Blood welled up. She inserted the pen tube into the pericardial space. The fluid came out, dark red, nearly black, pressure releasing like a dam breaking. 30 milliliters. 60. The cardiac monitor shifted. The rhythm suddenly had teeth again. A tracing. A beat. Another beat. Blood pressure climbing, 42, 51, 68. The O2 sat responding, 61, 72, 85. The heart could squeeze again because the pressure had released. Margaret secured the pen tube with tape. 2 liters normal saline, wide open. Type O negative. Get me an ultrasound and an arterial line. Call cardiothoracic surgery now. The resident stared at the fluid dripping from a ballpoint pen. At the patient's chest heaving with new life. At this woman whose hands had just stopped someone's heart from drowning in its own blood using equipment you could find at any desk. Go, Margaret said. The brother, now conscious, medication wearing off, watched from the adjacent bay. He'd been sedated before he could see what happened. But he saw it now. Saw her hands moving like surgical lasers through the crisis. Saw the monitor climb. Saw his brother live because someone didn't wait for permission. The next morning, by 9 o'clock, Margaret was called to the Human Resources office on the 3rd floor. She already knew what was waiting. The guns had stopped. Now the paperwork would begin. Dr. Whitfield sat across from her in a chair upholstered in corporate grey. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Chen whose discomfort was written across her face like a warning label, sat at the head of the table. Whitfield had brought props. Printed emails. Highlighted policy manuals with yellow markers bleeding through margins. A handwritten timeline on a legal pad, his script precise and careful, the documentation of a man building a case the way you build a case, methodically, piece by piece. Master Chief, he began, then caught himself. I mean, Ms. Walsh. You performed a surgical procedure last night without physician authorization or supervision. She didn't correct him. Master Chief. Military rank. He didn't know. He wouldn't know for another 6 days, but his mouth had already revealed that he suspected something. The pericardiocentesis, he continued, voice oozing concern the way a snake oozes venom, genuine-looking, genuine-sounding, completely designed to kill. You performed a surgical intervention without a written order from an attending physician. You used non-standard equipment, a writing instrument, Ms. Walsh, a ballpoint pen, to access the pericardial space. You violated Emergency Protocol Section 4.2.1, which explicitly requires physician presence for invasive procedures. He slid the folder across the table. Inside, printed correspondence. Emails from a nursing program coordinator, highlighted passages suggesting her credentials had been issued under irregular circumstances. The font was slightly different. The language patterns didn't match other emails in the thread. Whitfield had forged them or found someone who would. The man was competent. That was the problem. That was why this was working. Your hiring paperwork lists a graduation from Berkeley Nursing Program, 2008, Whitfield said. We contacted the program director. No record of any Margaret Walsh graduating that year. A lie, but delivered with the precision of something true. The real Margaret Walsh, Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, had never attended Berkeley. Her credentials were from Naval Medical Corps, 15 years classified, a life that officially didn't exist. This Margaret Walsh had bought a diploma online for $300 from a company that folded in 2012. It was good enough for a hospital that didn't ask questions, good enough for a state board that processed thousands of applications monthly. It was, for 6 months, good enough. "We're also concerned about your bedside manner," Whitfield continued. "Several staff members have reported feeling intimidated by your presence. Your lack of appropriate deference to physicians. Your willingness to give orders in clinical situations. Because those were the things that threatened him. Not her competence. Her command." Patricia Chen shifted in her seat. "The hospital takes protocol violations very seriously, Ms. Walsh. The suspension is temporary, pending an investigation. You're not to enter the trauma bay or access patient care areas during this time. You'll be contacted when we reach a conclusion." Whitfield smiled slightly. Not the smile of someone delivering bad news. The smile of someone who had cornered prey and was waiting for it to panic. Margaret's jaw locked. Once. Very briefly. A tremor that wasn't fear, it was restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from 20 years of practice keeping the weapon holstered when you had both the training and the cause to use it. She nodded. She stood. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She didn't tell them that the credentials didn't matter because the hands had performed the procedure correctly, that the protocol violation had saved a life, that their hierarchy of rules couldn't account for what happened when the patient was dying faster than permission could be granted. She left the office. She walked down the corridor of St. Michael's, the place she'd spent 6 months rebuilding a life, pushing a mop in the dark, earning trust by not asking for it, trying to be invisible. The invisibility was the prison. The invisibility was also the key. She understood that now. By 6 o'clock that evening, she sat in her car in the darkest corner of the parking garage. The concrete pillars cast shadows like prison bars across the dashboard. The engine was dead. The keys were in her lap. Her forehead rested against the steering wheel, and for the first time in 6 months, her grey hair came loose from its bun. It fell around her face like she was unraveling from the outside in. She couldn't move. She couldn't think past the weight pressing down on her chest, not cardiac tamponade, not blood loss, not the physical trauma of 3 tours in Tikrit. This was different. This was the weight of 2 decades trying to collapse into 2 identities that had no room to coexist. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, codename Valkyrie, who'd been ordered to disappear after Operation Buried Anchor. 12 sailors lost. 43 saved. The Black Ops extraction gone sideways, the Pentagon decision made in a room she'd never been invited to, for operational security, for deniability, for the classified archives, Margaret Walsh would cease to exist. Record scrubbed. Service erased. Survival dependent on invisibility. Margaret Walsh the nurse. 6 months old. Building something quiet. Helping people without anyone asking questions. No past. No medals. No proof. And Dr. Whitfield had exposed the cracks between them. He'd made it impossible to be both. She couldn't defend her credentials without explaining where the real ones had come from. She couldn't prove her competence without revealing her training. She couldn't save a life without confirming what she was hiding from, and hiding from was the only thing keeping her alive. The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's glowed through the concrete pillars, casting that hospital white across her windshield. The lights were 200 yards away. The trauma bay, where a man's life had been saved with a penknife and a ballpoint pen, was right there. The clinical bay where she'd been told she wasn't welcome. The place she'd thought she could build a second life. The combat boots were in her locker. Battered leather, salt-stained, the soles worn through from 3 tours. She'd kept them hidden beneath her regular clothes. They were the only proof. The only physical evidence that she'd ever existed as anything other than a nurse with forged credentials and steady hands. She sat in the dark for 3 hours. Her breathing never changed. No tears. No panic. No trembling. The combat medic in her recognized shock, not the medical kind, but the psychological equivalent. The kind that comes when two identities collide and neither one can survive the impact. Dr. Whitfield's office door locked behind him with a click that sounded like a coffin closing. His hand shook as he reached for his phone, the tremor not from fear but from the clarity of understanding that everything he'd built was collapsing in real time. The office smelled of expensive cologne and desperation, that particular metallic tang that comes when a man realizes his network is about to betray him. He'd made 17 calls in the last 40 minutes. 17. Board members who'd promised him favors, hospital administrators who'd eaten at his table, physicians he'd backed for promotions, all of them letting the call ring through to voicemail, all of them suddenly unavailable. The legal team had stopped returning messages entirely. One attorney left a voicemail that made his blood go white. "We need to talk about your involvement in the Walsh matter. Do not contact Margaret Walsh again. Do not attempt any further action. Do not attempt any further action." The words looped in his skull like a threat. The FBI was on campus. He'd seen them in the lobby that morning, badges visible, moving through the hospital with the casual authority of people who didn't need to ask permission. The Pentagon investigation meant federal scrutiny. It meant every decision he'd made regarding Margaret's suspension would be examined by people who had subpoena power. Every call he'd made, every fabricated complaint, every colleague he'd pressured into signing off on the suspension, all of it now discoverable, all of it now evidence. He pulled up Margaret's HR file on his computer. His login still worked. His hands moved across the keyboard with the jerky precision of panic. If he could prove she'd lied on her hiring paperwork, if he could show she'd misrepresented her credentials, then she became the problem. Not him. Not his decision to fire her. He added entries to her employment history, backdated to 15 years earlier. Created a false nursing school from a university that no longer existed. Changed her credential verification dates. Forged a reference letter from a fictional program director, signing it with a name he invented on the spot. His typing was loud in the quiet office, each keystroke sounding like a hammer strike. The forgeries were sloppy, he knew it even as he was creating them, knew they wouldn't survive 30 seconds of scrutiny, but his mind wasn't working anymore. Fear was piloting the ship. Fear and the absolute certainty that if Margaret Walsh's military service became a matter of public record, the Pentagon investigation would expand to examine everyone who'd had access to her file, everyone who'd attempted to block her career. He was 20 minutes into the work when the knock came. Not a knock, a sound like thunder. A fist against glass. 2 agents entered without waiting for a response. Their suits were dark, their expressions devoid of anything resembling sympathy. One of them was already reading from a tablet, the words coming out with the flat authority of federal procedure, "Dr. Whitfield. We're with the FBI. We have a warrant to examine your computer systems and your access to employee personnel files." The screen was still visible behind him. The forged documents glowing in bright text. Margaret Walsh. Fake credentials. Backdated entries. All of it incompetently altered, all of it obviously wrong the moment anyone looked. One of the agents moved to the computer without speaking. The other one was reading Whitfield his rights, the Miranda warnings pouring out in a monotone that sounded like an automated system, and that was when Whitfield understood, really understood, that this wasn't a conversation. This was a conclusion. They cuffed him in his own office. The metal bands on his wrists were surprisingly cold. The click of the locks engaging sounded like finality. The walk from his office to the lobby took 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, Whitfield experienced the systematic dismantling of his life. Nurses lined the hallways. Staff members appeared in doorways. The hospital security guard, a Navy veteran with a scarred face, stood in the corridor and watched him pass with an expression of profound contempt. Every phone in the building seemed to produce a camera. Every camera captured the image of Dr. Whitfield in scrubs, hands cuffed behind his back, flanked by federal agents, moving through the institution he believed would protect him. The perp walk through St. Michael's lobby was recorded from 6 different angles. By evening, the footage would be shared across hospital message boards. By morning, it would be playing on local news. By the end of the week, the medical director would formally revoke his privileges. By the end of the month, he would be fired. The state medical board would open an investigation. Charges would be filed: obstruction of a federal investigation, falsification of official records, fraud. The board members who'd once owed him favor sent statements through their lawyers, distancing themselves from him, denying they'd known about his fabrication scheme, claiming they'd been misled by his recommendations. His allies evaporated like water under heat. His network, which he'd spent 20 years cultivating, abandoned him in the time it took for the news cycle to turn. 6 months later, the St. Michael's Trauma Bay hummed its familiar fluorescent song, and Margaret Walsh stood in the center of it wearing scrubs with the calm of someone who'd already survived worse. Much worse. Her grey hair was pulled back tight, the same style she'd worn since the first day, a detail so familiar that the younger nurses didn't even notice it anymore. They only saw the limp, a souvenir from Tikrit that never quite faded, and the way she moved through crisis with the fluid grace of someone who'd been trained by forces that most people would never understand. The Pentagon had cleared her for civilian service. Her record, partially unsealed, acknowledged. Her past integrated with her present. The hospital had wanted to make a ceremony of it, but she'd declined. Recognition was a liability when you'd spent 15 years invisible, when your survival had depended on no one knowing your name. The trauma team, 6 nurses and 4 residents, gathered around her as she walked them through the procedures she'd learned in a place most of them couldn't locate on a map. When you're moving fast, she was saying, her voice carrying the weight of experience, you're not thinking. You're remembering. The body remembers what the mind forgets. One of the residents asked about the cricothyrotomy technique she'd mentioned, the emergency airway procedure using improvised tools. Margaret paused, considering how much to reveal. 3rd intercostal space, midclavicular line. 2-finger breadth below the clavicle. The incision goes perpendicular to the long axis of the neck. She demonstrated on a mannequin torso, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done it under fire. You work fast. You don't apologize. You don't second-guess. You move. The residents watched her hands, scarred, steady, marked with the subtle calluses of someone who'd been handling medical equipment for decades. In her locker, the pair of worn combat boots sat on the top shelf, visible now, no longer hidden. The leather was creased in ways that told stories: rapid deployment creases, firefight creases, carrying wounded across desert creases. She didn't wear them anymore. She didn't need to. Her authority was no longer a secret. The ranger patient came by on his monthly visit, walking without the limp that had plagued him 6 months earlier, his recovery complete. He always brought coffee, strong, black, the kind that tastes like discipline, and he always sat in the staff break room and called her Master Chief, the rank hanging in the air between them like a secret they shared. "How are the green boots handling the load?" he'd ask, using the old terminology from Tikrit, and Margaret would tell him they were holding steady. On a cold morning in February, something unexpected happened. Someone spotted Dr. Whitfield in a strip mall parking lot 2 towns over, San Diego sprawling in the distance behind him. He was sitting at a folding table with a banner reading supplemental insurance policies, affordable rates, competitive premiums. His suit jacket was worn at the elbows. His expression was hollow as he handed flyers to people who didn't make eye contact, who took the papers out of politeness and discarded them in the nearest trash. He saw a news van drive past and turned away, his face suddenly older than it should have been, aged by the velocity of his own collapse. Back at St. Michael's, Margaret wrapped up a training session, and one of the new nurses, a young woman named Casey with steady hands and steadier eyes, asked how she stayed so calm during the armed crisis 6 months earlier. Margaret paused. She thought of Tikrit. She thought of the sailors whose names she'd never spoken aloud, whose families would never know exactly how they died because the operations were classified. She thought of 15 years underground, of being erased, of becoming nothing so that others could be protected. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most, she said quietly. When you understand what you're capable of surviving, fear becomes information instead of paralysis. You move toward the crisis because you've already moved through worse. Casey nodded, processing this, understanding that she was receiving wisdom earned in ways she'd probably never fully comprehend. Margaret pulled on her jacket, the seams fitting like they'd been tailored to her body. She nodded to the team. She walked to her car, a nondescript sedan, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, and drove home through the San Diego evening, the ocean visible in the distance like something from a different life. The combat boots remained in the locker. She didn't need to wear them to remember who she was. The memory lived in her hands, in her voice, in the way she moved through a room like someone who'd been trained to survive impossible circumstances. That was enough. That would always be enough. If you've made it this far, you understand what it means to stay invisible, to carry your entire life inside yourself, and to prove your worth not with words but with action. Subscribe to see more stories of people who walk toward crisis when everyone else runs. Like this video if you believe that true heroes don't always wear uniforms. Comment below, what would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have fought back, or would the weight have been too much?